In this video, we're going to build a Medium clone using NextJs Clerk for authentication and Convex as our backend platform. Now, Convex is a full stack TypeScript development platform where you can create databases, file storage, and scheduling cron jobs and triggers. You can think of it as an alternative to Firebase, but better because it has end-to-end type safety. It gives you everything that you need from your backend while you're only writing TypeScript or type-safe JavaScript. For example, you don't need an ORM like Prisma to connect your database. You're basically using Convex SDK or TypeScript really to create your schemas, define tables, and connect your database, upload files, retrieve files, and more. We're going to explain step by step as we're building our application what this platform is and how you can use it. But let me show you what we're going to build from a nutshell, and then we're going to dive in deeper into building this from scratch together. So as I mentioned, we're building a Medium clone where you can publish different blog posts. This is using Novel, which is a WYSIWYG editor, a Notion style editor. We have covered it in the past on the channel. I'm going to reference videos where you need to dive deeper into specific technologies throughout this video, so we're not repeating ourselves. You can reference those videos, links in the description or up in the card somewhere anytime that I'm mentioning something that we have covered on the channel before. So you can publish blog posts. User can come in here and start writing. So from the homepage, if you click on the right, you have to log in as a user to be able to write. So I'm going to use my Google account to log in here. Once I'm on the new post or writing page, I can create a new blog post. The first line is to select a file for the cover image. Let me just make this a bit bigger. I apologize if this is smaller. Once we switch to coding mode, I'm going to make it full screen so it's bigger. I've heard from folks in the comment that my code is still small, so I made an effort to just capture the screen this time so I can go full screen and make it bigger. Let me know if it is better this time. But once you're on this page, you can select the file, and this opens up a new nice dialog. This dialog that I have opened, or by clicking on this, is just opening up my file picker here. You won't be able to see that, unfortunately, the way that I am capturing this specific tab. I'm not able to share that. So let's just select an image here. I have selected this image. I can confirm upload. This is going to upload this to Convex. It's going to give me back an ID. As you can see, that ID is now set inside of here. I can give my post a title. So new post from tutorial. And the slug is automatically created. You can come in and change this if you didn't want to, but it just basically creates a slug safe or a URL safe slug from your post. You can create a little short description or excerpt for your post. So this is a blog post. And then here it's our WYSIWYG editor where you can just hit / for any type of element that you want. In this example, this is a heading. You can write, this is a paragraph, so you can write simple paragraphs. You can add maybe list item, and then here you can just hit / for your list items. So let's say bullet list, item 1, item 2. It's good for now. Then we can go ahead and create a post, which is going to create that blog post inside of our Convex database. It's going to redirect the user back to that page with the content that we just created here. And if we go back to the home page now and make this a bit smaller, sorry. So for you to see, now this newly created blog post is up top because we are ordering what we're showing inside of our fetch from our database here in a descending order. So whatever is published latest is going to be the first one here. So let's jump right into the code. We're going to extend our next Clerk template. I'm going to walk you through the setup there, and then we're going to build the rest of the integration with Convex from that point on. So let me go full screen. I'm going to make this bigger. Let me just also increase this to a nice size. Let's go to Convex, and actually let's start from our Next Clerk template. This is a public template, which is NextJS, ShatsCN, dark and light theme, and Clerk already set up here. I have a video on the channel where I walk you through actually creating this template with the Clerk version 2, which is the new version with some changes in the middleware. So I'm going to link in this, put the link in the description for that video if you're not familiar with setting up Clerk authentication and user management in Next.js. Definitely watch that video. I'm not going to go over the details here. We're just going to set this up. If you want to start from scratch with me, you can just come in here and use this as a template and create a copy of it, then clone it down into your local machine and start building. Now, the link to the final project is also going to be in the description below. So if you want to compare, as we're building this project together, you have the source code or the final version of the source code down in the description. So I'm going to use this as a template, create a new repository. Let's call this medium, and create this repository. Once you create this, it is basically going to create a copy of that template, and then you can clone your own local version or your own version to your local machine. So I'm going to hit this. Let me just switch tabs to my VS Code here. I've already created a directory called medium clone. So I'm going to say git clone, copy that, and I'm going to set the current working directory so it's not going to create that again. So let's clear this out. I'm going to open the files here. Hopefully this is big enough for folks watching this on smaller devices, but still let me know if this is big enough. Maybe I can make this even bigger. So let's go pnpmi to install all the packages. Now let me also bring in an example of everything that we need to set this up. Now for Clerk, we are going to create a new application on Clerk shortly. So we're going to get our publishable key and secrets from there. As we're building the application together, there are more environment variables that you need to set. Either they're going to be set automatically in the case of Convex, or we have to set them manually in the case of our webhook secret. I'm going to mention what you need, but there is this .env.example in the repository, which is a reference to everything that you would need throughout the application. So because I have Clerk now, I can go back and open up, maybe close this up, and we can go to Clerk. Let me just go to my dashboard. And now I can create a new application. Let's call this medium, the same thing as we named it there. Let's leave the email and Google for now. You can always update this later on inside of your channel. Once you create a new project, it will be redirected to this page where it just basically walks you through setting up a Clerk in Next.js. So if you have copied the template that I have, we've already done this. So we've already installed Clerk Next.js. So let's go to package.json just to make sure. Let me close off the terminal for now. So we already have the Clerk Next.js installed, so you don't need to reinstall that if you've copied the package. If you're starting from scratch, definitely go ahead and install the package. Now you need to bring in this local environment variables or your secrets to your local env as we just did. So let's copy this. I'm going to copy this inside of my project.env.local and come back. Okay, I've copied my credentials from Clerk to my .env.local. Now the next step is to create our Clerk middleware. So that's the third step here. Now back inside of our project, again, if you've copied the code or if you've followed the template, you already have the Clerk middleware set up. The way this project is set up is that we have this protected folder that contains some client and server protected routes, just as an example of how you would go about protecting a specific route in Next.js using Clerk, and then how you would access the session data inside of client and server component. So up top, we have created this protected route matcher, which is just going to match the protected. I'm going to add our right to this. So anything that starts with the right, this is where we would need our users to actually sign up before they're able to create a new blog post or write a new blog post. The path for us is going to be /write. Now, using that function returned from this function, you can decide whether or not the user is actually on one of these protected routes. And if they are, you can call this auth function passed to your middleware and the protect function on it, which basically is going to check to see if the user is authenticated. If they are, they can go ahead. If they're not, it's going to automatically redirect them back to the sign-in page. So that's all this is doing. Now, you can do this manually by checking the session, using the next response to redirect them, but this just does that under the hood. So that was our middleware. Now with that, we need to now wrap our entire app in root layout with this clerk provider. Let me also make this bigger. I have to remember making this pages bigger so folks can have a easier time reading what's on the screen. So let's go back to our application. Again, if you've started with the template, it's already wrapped inside of our clerk provider, as you can see here. So we are all good to go. Let's go to the next step. Now you can run the development and your app is now protected using this. Now let me go back to the project and show you from a high level what we are dealing with here. We've already looked at the root layout, where we are rendering the root layout of our application, the HTML body tag. We are wrapping everything in the clerk provider. I also have this custom providers component where we are putting in any client-side provider that we want, such as the theming. So let's dive into that for a second. So here I am wrapping everything with the theme provider from Next Themes and also a toast provider from ShatCN or from the Sonar package. Anytime that we wanted to show a toast notification, we're going to read through this. So this provider is basically getting this toaster and passing the resolved theme to it and providing it inside of our application here. Now, we are wrapping our entire app with a client component. Common question is that does this now turn our entire app into a client component? The answer is no. You can pass in server components as props to children component to client components. I'm going to say it again. You can pass server components as props to client components without turning them into client components. So one of the props that there is in React is a children prop. So we're passing in our server pages and nested layouts as children to this client provider or client component, which is marked with this use client. And that's okay. It doesn't turn them into client component. There is an awesome tutorial or video by Delba from Vercel that I just happened to see this morning. I'm going to include a link in the description to that video as well. It's one of the best explanations of the new React server client architecture, so definitely give that a watch as well. If you haven't understood this concept correctly, there are videos on my channel that I have talked about the server client architecture. So I'm going to include links in the description. Make sure to check them out. So this was the provider's component. We have a header, we have a footer that wraps our entire app. So let's actually open up our dev server and pm dev. Let's close this off. Let's go, actually, let's just click on this. It'll be easier. So let's see if everything is working inside of our application. Then we're going to continue with setting up Convex and actually hooking up Clerk and Convex together so we can have authentication inside of Convex and also save the users that we have in Clerk or sync them with our Convex database. So it seems like everything is working nicely here. We have the nice and the light and dark theme here. We have the sign in button, which is going to open up this modal. You can also change this to open up the page. So if we go to the component and header, we are using drop-in components from Clerk. Again, if you're not comfortable with Clerk, definitely watch the video that's in the description. So we are using these control components to decide what to show. If the user signed out, we're going to show a sign in button. That was the button that you just saw. And this mode modal is going to open up a modal instead of redirecting the user to sign-in page. Now for this application, I've created custom sign-in pages. So I have my own custom sign-in pages instead of the hosted version from Clerk. So if I go back to the application and now click sign in, it's going to redirect the user back to my sign in page, which is basically rendering the same sign-in component, but instead of my own page. It's just something that you know inside of our application. Okay, so let's go back actually now that we know how our application is set up to Convex and get started with setting this up inside of Next.js. So let's go to get started. If you haven't had an account before, it is going to prompt you to log in. I've already created an account, so I'm already logged into my project. So go ahead and create an account if you don't have any. And then from here, you can just hit create a new project. Let's also call this Medium again for the consistency. I've already created a Medium clone before when I was creating this project. So I'm going to create a new project so we can walk through every step together. Now from here, you can see your dashboard. This is where everything that you would define in Convex exists. You can create data. This is your databases. You can create different tables. You can create different functions that query and mutate the data or correspond to your, communicate to your file storage. This is the file storage that you have. You can upload files here, or you can upload files programmatically via the API. You can schedule tasks and functions like cron jobs to run. You have access to logs and different settings here. Pretty easy to just support your backend from one comprehensive platform instead of having to use different technologies. So it's definitely a nice way of setting up our backend here. So let's go to Convex again. Now this time I want to open up the documentation. So let's go documentation. Now in the docs, there are quick starts for different platforms or frameworks. We're going to select Next.js and follow this one. Okay, so I'm going to stay here. Okay, so assuming that you've already created your Next.js app, you can skip here. Now we need to install Convex. So let's go back to our application, open up the terminal. Maybe I can just have this open at all times, but smaller. So therefore I don't have to keep opening and closing this. So npm add Convex. So that's the first step. The second step is to run npx convex dev. This is going to initialize a Convex application in our project, add some files to it, which we're going to examine together, and also add our credentials. So let's run this together. So I'm using pnpm, so I'm going to run pnpm dlx convex dev. If you're using npm, you can just say npx convex dev. So let's hit enter. If you're not logged in here, it is going to ask you to log in at this point. It's asking for my device name and asking to open my browser to log in. I'm going to confirm this code. And you can close this tab, go back to the application. We are now logged inside of our terminal to our Convex project. It asks me whether I want to create a new project or choose an existing project. I'm going to hit choose an existing project. It's going to ask me which one, so I'm going to select the Medium. Now, all this had done is created this Convex folder inside of my application here. There's the generated API. You can think of it as the Prisma client. So anytime that you are working with Prisma, it reads the schemas from your system and creates a specific client that works with your schema. Now, this is also a server-side function generated, or APIs generated based on the tables, schemas, and data that you would include here in a similar fashion. And also, it should have added some environment variables to my .env.local. I'm not going to open that up, but again, inside the .env.example, now these two values should have been automatically populated for you by running the npx convex dev. Now, something else to keep in mind is that this is synchronizing your local development project with your project that's hosted on Convex. So you should have this running at all times. If you can see here, it says Convex functions are ready to run. So this is just syncing everything real time with your Convex dashboard. So I'm going to open up a new terminal to just run my pm dev. Anytime that I want to run my application, I'm going to leave that Convex server running at all times. So let's go back to the docs. We've completed this step. Now, in the next step, it is actually helping us to seed some sample data into our database by using this JSON-L file. We're not going to do this. You're more than welcome to do it if you want to seed sample data and then query your database. We're going to do this when we are actually creating our own blog posts. But if you want, you can just copy this inside of this sample data.jsonl file inside of your local project, and then run this command, which is going to run convex import, create a table called tasks from this file. Now, in the next step, it is going to actually show us how you would go about querying your database. Now, inside of our Convex folder, we're going to create these modules, which are going to be basically organizing our functions that work with specific files and databases inside of our Convex backend. For example, here we can create a task.ts file, which is going to be all the functions that works with the tasks table inside of our Convex database. So we can use this query function from the generated server to create a get function that helps us to fetch all of our tasks from our tasks table. Again, if this is not comfortable the way that we are writing it, we're going to go over these steps when we're actually querying our own database. But you can pass in arguments and a handler function, which is going to be called anytime that you call that function. This is basically using the context object passed to this handler and the DB object on it to run a query against our tasks table and collect all of the data. Now, to provide these different hooks that Convex works with, we can have this Convex client provider to wrap our entire application. So therefore, we can actually access these hooks. So let's do this, and then in the next step, we're going to also see a mutation example or a use of this hooks that now works because of this context provider inside of our application. So let's do this inside of our code. Let me just go back for a second here. So let's open up our providers component. Now inside of this, I'm going to get this Convex client provider, import it here. Again, let me just make this smaller. So we're going to create this Convex client provider in a second. And then the idea is that we're going to wrap this provider that we have here with that provider. So let's just also do that. So basically what I did is I came inside of my own providers component and now wrapped everything with this Convex client provider. Now let's go ahead and create this component for ourselves. So this is going to be Convex client provider.tsx. Now, let me just leave this part of it out for now. This is for when we want to implement this with our clerk. So what we need to get is actually Convex provider. Okay, I hope I didn't confuse you here too much. Just ignore these two lines for a second. This is for when we're actually going to bring in clerk authentication and integrate these two together. So they're working together with the authentication. Now, just as the documentation was showing us, we need to get this context provider and the React client from Convex React, because at this point, we are just using React specific client here. We're going to create a new Convex client by passing in our public Convex URL. Again, this is populated automatically when we ran the convex dev command. And I'm just returning this convex provider and pass the client to it, which is this convex client, and then wrap the children. Now, again, I brought this convex client provider into my own provider so that I can wrap everything here. Let me see why we have this. Is there a naming issue? Let's just run the develop server, the VS Code server here. Sometimes refreshing or reloading your VS Code gets rid of the errors, specifically TypeScript errors, which seems to be the case here. So instead of wrapping my entire app, instead of wrapping my entire app inside of the layouts with this convex provider, which was here, what I did is that I brought it into this providers component, wrapped everything there with this custom client component, which is just using the convex provider under the hood to wrap any children passed to it. Okay. So our files are nice and organized. So once you create this custom component, it is telling you to bring it to your root layout and wrap the children with it. This is exactly what we did. We just brought it into this providers, and this provider is what is actually wrapping our children with some extra header and footer components. Okay. Now that we have this context provider, we can use these hooks from Convex, for example, use query inside of our client components to use these functions we just created. So let's say here I'm using the use query. This is coming from Convex React. And this API is the generated API or the specific API that's tailored to my own tasks and tables and schemas. It is reaching the tasks table. It's reading the file name that this was defined on. And on it, we defined a get function. And this is going to return all the tasks to me. So I can map over the tasks and show them here. Now, if you run npm run dev, this actually runs your NextJS development server, which is going to be all hooked up with your Convex app now. Now, I've provided some list for myself to keep track of what we need to do. So we created an account. We followed the next quick start guide. Now we need to actually integrate Convex and Clerk together before we're actually defining any schemas to bring in our users from Clerk to Convex. So let's go to the next step, which is adding Clerk and Convex together so that we can have access to authentication inside of our Convex functions. So let's go back to here. Inside of the documentation, there is this section about authentication, and there's this Clerk section, which walks you through what you need to do to integrate the two together. Now, Convex also has an auth on its own, or auth 0 integration. So check that out if you're interested. I'm going to use Clerk for this tutorial. So this first step is to sign up for Clerk. Let's actually, well, we have already signed up for Clerk. I forgot that part. Create an application. We did that. The next thing we need to do is to create a custom jot template that's basically talking to Convex. So let's go to our dashboard. And here, up inside of this configure tab, we can scroll down to JWT templates and create a new template and select Convex from the list here. This is going to set a new jot template for us. You can save this. And all you need from this file is this issuer URL that you're going to need to set inside of your project. But before I copy this, let's go to the next step, which instructs you to create this auth.config.ts inside of your Convex folder and copy this issuer domain and the application ID. So let me copy this go back inside of my VS Code, and now inside of my Convex, I'm going to create a file called auth.config.ts, and I'm going to copy this. Now this domain needs to be replaced with your specific issuer where you can get this from your Clerk dashboard. So I'm going to come to this JOT template, to the Convex template that I created. You leave the name because it works as the ID the same. You don't change the Convex. The only thing you get is this issuer. You can just copy this and come back out of this, go back to your code, and now you can replace this entire thing with your specific issuer, which points to the specific domain Clerk created for your account. And you can leave everything else the same. So you can exit out of this, go back to the docs. So we have created that template, copied the issuer, brought it into our auth.config.ts. Now you can install the Clerk and Clerk React. If you are working with React side, now we're going to do this from the Next.js project, because Clerk also exports some Next.js specific functions for us. So we've already done this part of it. This is for if you had not had Clerk installed already. So we've already installed this. Now all you need to do here for this to work is we've already wrapped our entire app with the Clerk provider. All we need to do is to go inside of our Convex provider that we just finished in the last step. We need to change this to a function or to a component that comes from React Clerk. So it works specifically with Clerk that shares the auth context as well. And then we need to pass this use auth to that provider to be pointed to the use auth from our Clerk. Okay, so let's go back to our application. And if you remember, I commented some stuff out there. So I'm going to bring this guys back in. So instead of using the Convex provider, we are going to use the Convex provider with Clerk. So we're going to replace these two components. And now this guy needs a use auth, which we're going to get from Clerk Next.js use auth. So we are basically telling Convex to say, hey, anytime you needed to use auth, just use Clerk. Clerk is already authenticating our application. We're sharing the user or auth context here. So therefore, we can use Clerk to also access that same session so that we have access to our authenticated user inside of our Convex functions. Okay, so we no longer need this guy. I just walked through the documentation step by step. If you were not using Clerk, so you could just go ahead and set up Convex provider the way that it was before this. If you're doing it with me with Clerk, you can just follow these steps. And that's all we need to do to integrate Clerk and authentication, or Clerk and Convex together. Now, if you want to show UI based on authentication state, you can now use this controlled component from Convex React, authenticated, unauthenticated, and use query. So a similar concept as the drop-in component in Clerk. Convex also has this component where you can show sign-in button, user button, and your content. Or you can use query. And now inside of your queries or your functions that talks to Convex, you have access to the current user. So let's look at this current user implementation. We have created a new function called get for current user, or get messages for current user, assuming that we have a messages table and there different users have different messages, and we only want to fetch the messages that belongs to the current user. Now inside of our context object in our handler, we have access to this auth object, and on it we can call the get user identity. This is going to read the user identity passed in from Clerk to gives us the identity of the user logged in. If they're not logged in, we're throwing an error. Otherwise, we're just filtering our query based on documents that have this author field set to whatever this identity.email is. So that's how we can get access to auth context inside of our Convex functions. Okay. Similar thing, you can have login and logout flows or different views. It's basically the same way as you would use your drop-in components for your clerk. We're not going to use these components, but now we have our clerk set up, we have our Convex set up, and we have also glued together. So clerk and Convex are now working together. Now, in the next step, what I want to do is to actually store my users inside of our Convex database. Now, the way that it works now is that once somebody logs into our clerk account, they will be authenticated, and they will also be authenticated on the Convex side. But still, we don't have the user data in our Convex database. You can leave it at clerk if you want, but I want to take the extra step of defining a webhook that brings in all of our user data from clerk also to our Convex, so we can work with them inside of our own database as well. And that's what we're going to do that. So we created this template. We created the auth config. We replaced the client provider with the provider that came with clerk. So let's close this off. Next step, let's store users in Convex database. So we have to add a clerk webhook. There's a piece in the documentation that walks us through this. Let me just find this. It should be somewhere here. So storing users in the Convex database, you can click this. This is basically walking you through the same thing that I'm going to be explaining here. Now, there's two ways that you can store users from clerk into your database. One is calling mutations from the client side. The other one is setting up a webhook. I'm going to select setting up a webhook. So on your clerk dashboard, go to webhooks and add an endpoint. Your endpoint should be your deployment name at convex.site clerk user webhook. So you're going to have this webhook, which is basically an endpoint inside of your clerk backend. So typically when you want to sync data from clerk to your own backend, you would need to create a route handler inside of your NextJs app, an API endpoint that exposes a post function. We have done this before. There is also a video on the channel where I talk about syncing data from clerk to your own database, links in the description. But basically, you would create a post endpoint, and you would define this webhook inside clerk and say, hey, every time a user is created, updated, or deleted, just hit this endpoint inside of my NextJs app. There, we're going to verify the signature that this webhook is coming from clerk, and then we're going to just update our database. Now here, instead of having this endpoint inside of our own NextJs app, we're going to define this endpoint inside of our Convex dashboard. So if we don't even need to have this endpoint inside of our NextJs app, we're going to define this inside of our Convex app. Now this deployment name or your specific URL, it is what is already set inside of your local environment variables when you ran the Convex dev. The only difference is that the one you have there, it ends with .cloud, but this one is .site. There's also this part that you can access it from your dashboard. So if you go to your dashboard, you go to your settings, you go to your environment variables or to your project setting. Nope. Let's go back. Okay, here, the first one. Deploy keys. So show development credentials. I'm going to show it anyways. We're going to delete this after. So the deployment URL is what ends with cloud. The HTTP actions URL, or what we need, is the same thing but ends in .site. And that's what's saying inside of here. It says that make sure that your URL that you set here ends with the .site, not .cloud. Okay, so let's actually copy this endpoint. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to clerk. I'm going to scroll down to webhooks. We can create an endpoint here. I'm going to paste this in, and then there's also this part of it, which says clerk user webhook. So this all together is going to construct the endpoint that it is going to listen to clerk webhooks. Now down here, you can just filter based on user specific events and then hit create. Okay. So we got our deployment URL or endpoint URL, and we set that inside of our Clerk webhook. Now you also need to create this in your .env.local. So let me go to Clerk dashboard and actually edit this. Let's copy this whole thing. Okay, no worries. We don't need this one. My bad. We need the secret. So that's the next step. So we have created the endpoint. We have filtered the messages or triggers based on the users. Now we need to bring in our webhook secret. Okay. So this secret just makes sure that we are responding to events that are coming from Clerk, because you are exposing a public endpoint at this point, which means anyone can just send you post requests. To make sure they are coming actually from Clerk, you need to use the webhook secret. Now, inside of your dashboard where you just created the webhook, there's this signing secret here that you can just click on. It shows you your signing secret. Now, you need to set this up in two places. One is inside of your Convex dashboard. So let's copy the environment name. I'm going to go back to my dashboard. Let's go to environment variables and add this environment variable. So the name is Clerk webhook secret. And then the value, let's also copy this inside of our local environment variable. So if I go back to my project for a second, in this .env.example, you can see there is this Clerk webhook secret. So you have to also copy this inside of your local env. And if you are deploying this application later on, also inside of your deployment environment, we're going to deploy this to Vercel. So we need to have this environment variable there as well. So let's go back and actually bring in the value for this. So inside of Clerk dashboard, let's copy this value and go back to our Convex dashboard. Let's paste in the value that we have. So we have set this secret inside of the environment variables in our project in Convex. Now, as I mentioned, this endpoint is just going to live inside Convex. So we are not even creating this endpoint in our Next.js app. This is going to automatically receive the Clerk webhook, create the user data, and sync in with our application without us having to create this endpoint. Okay, so that step is also completed. I'm going to copy this secret inside of my local env as well. So I have it there. Now, the next step for us is to actually define our user schema in Convex. Okay, so we have completed this endpoint and that. Now we want to define a user schema. So we want to have a user table inside of our Convex DB, and we want to just define what the shape would be. Now you don't need to define a schema. Convex is loose or flexible in that end. It just feels like it's like a MongoDB database where you can just drop in documents. It actually detects the schema and recommends the shape of your data. You don't require to have a schema, but to have type safety end to end, we're going to define a schema, then create that table from that schema so that we know what a user object should look like. Now let's see how we would create schemas. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to go back to my application. Let's just close everything up here. I'm going to go to my Convex folder and create a file called schema.ts. And inside of here, I'm going to define my schemas. Okay. So I'm getting this defined schema from Convex server and define table to define tables and schemas. Now ignore these posts. This is for blog posts that we're going to create later. But for now, we want to create a users table. Now users are going to have email. This is the information coming back from Clerk. They're going to have a Clerk user ID. This is our foreign key connecting a database record inside of our Convex database with Clerk. First name, last name, image, and posts. Now for first name, last name, and image, you can see I have created optional values because sometimes if they're using, let's say, an email magic link to sign in, they're not going to have first name, last name. So that's optional, as well as the image URL. And for posts, we are just referencing to an array of IDs from our posts table. We've also made that optional because once the user is created for the first time, they don't have any posts, but they can create blog posts later on. So it's optional, and it's an array of posts. You could have passed in an array of strings, but this is a more specific type from Convex, which is saying that this is referencing unique IDs in our posts table. I've also created an index for our users table, and I've called it by Clerk user ID. This is referencing the Clerk user ID, this field. So therefore, anytime that I want to search for my users based on their Clerk ID, this is going to be a fast execution or query. So this is how I define this. Now, if I open up my terminal and go to the first tab where we are running Convex still, this detects any changes you make to your Convex folder and deploys these changes to your hosted Convex platform. And now we don't have any errors, as it says functions are ready. Now, once you set this, if you go to your Convex dashboard now, go back to the data, okay, my bad. I have actually created this schema inside of this generated, which is just automatically created. We should create this right inside of our Convex. So let me just close this off. And I'm going to just bring this inside of this Convex. So not inside the dot underscore generated, because this is automatically generated from our schemas, but inside of the Convex directly here. Now with this, if I open up the terminal, let's see. Okay, so this is actually reading this different tables. So added the table indexes. It is validating the schemas. So it reads our changes and it's now creating those indexes and synchronizing everything with our hosted Convex. So if I now go to my Convex, I should be able to see these two tables, posts and users. Now I don't have any data inside of them, but now we have these two tables shaped nicely with type safety. So this is what we did, define user schema. Now we want to add user mutation functions. Okay, so let's go back inside of our project, and similar to the way that it was showing us to in the documentation, we're going to create a file called users inside of our Convex. And this is where we're going to store all of our user specific functions. Okay, so let me just walk you through what I have created here that would enable us to actually sync the user data from Clerk to Convex. Now, the one thing I need to install is this Clerk backend. So let me just make sure that this is a standalone package. It seems like it is. This allows us to talk or get the backend SDK from Clerk. So let's go pm add Clerk backend. Okay, so let's close this off and see what we're doing here. So let's say we want to get all of our users. So again, just like similar organization that we used to have on the channel on different videos, even if we are working with our own custom databases or ORMs like Prisma, I usually like to store all of the related functions in a module. For example, we're working with users, we're working with tasks, we're working with messages. We're just going to combine all of the query functions and mutations in one file. This is a similar concept. We're just storing all of our user-specific functions in one file. Now here for getting all the users, for example, I'm getting the query method from the generated server client. This has two arguments passed to this object, an argument or args object. You can define functions where you require arguments to be passed to this handler, and we're going to see examples of that later on. And also you would expose a handler from this query function, which is in this case going to access the context object, the DB method on it, and query our users table and collect all the users. This is to get or fetch all of our users. Now I have get recent users. It's a similar function. It orders the users descending, so the most recent created user will be first, and only takes 5 records. So it doesn't fetch all, it just fetches 5. The current is going to get us the current user. It is actually calling another function we've defined in this file, passes the context. So let's see what that function is doing. Get current user. So this is going to use this same get user identity function that we just saw in the documentation that's now accessible on the auth context. That's just giving us the currently authenticated user from Clerk. Because of the integration that we made, now we have access to that session data inside of our context object in our Convex functions. So we get the currently logged in user. If we don't have any, we return null. Otherwise, we call this get user by Clerk user ID or user by Clerk user ID function, which is another function that we've defined in this file. And to this, we pass the context and also the identity.subject. Now, the identity.subject is the Clerk user ID. That's the foreign key that we have already set up. If we have that user inside of our Convex database, that's the foreign key, the external key that we have inside of our database. So user by Clerk user ID is just this function down here. That's going to query our users table, use an index that we just created in our schemas. If you remember, I created this by Clerk user ID index. It's going to then search for a user that has this Clerk user ID that we just passed to it. And this is going to be a unique user. Now, anytime you create an index on a field inside Convex, it will be unique. It doesn't have this, you can't just define a field to be unique, just similar to how you would do like in Prisma. You can't mark it as unique, but one way to just enforce uniqueness on a field is to create an index on it. And anytime that, let's say you want to do any mutation, you check to see if that specific value already exists. Nonetheless, so we get the user by the Clerk ID that's giving us the current user, which is a function that we just called in from here. So these 3 last functions is just to get us the currently logged in user from the auth context by their Clerk ID. Now we have 2 more functions, upsert from Clerk and delete from Clerk. Now upsert is insert or update. This is going to respond in Clerk webhooks when they're coming, when the user is generated and doesn't exist in our database. We're going to insert that new user. And it also is going to act as the update function where an update event comes from Clerk. Let's say the user has updated their image or their first name, last name. Then we're going to run the update function. Now here, if you're running internal mutation, this is another type of function you can run. Instead of running a query or a mutation, you can also run internal mutation. So this is not exposing this function necessarily to the use mutation hooks. It's just internally doing this. And as you can see here, to the args object, we are now passing in some data. I'm passing in some data, which is going to be of type user JSON. And this user JSON is what we got out of the Clerk backend. Hence, we needed to install this package. So we say the user object that comes, the data is of this shape. It comes from Clerk. Now inside of our handler, we get access to the context. Before we didn't have this data. This is basically the args. So you get the context and the args. This args is the same args that's passed to this function when called. And all we're doing is we're just destructuring the data on it because we know there's a data property on it, or we need to pass a data property. Now I'm going to create a user object or user attributes, setting emails to be the data. This is what comes from Clerk webhook, accessing the email address, the ID, the first name, last name, and image URL. Once I have that data, I'm going to check to see if I have that user by that Clerk ID. So context data.id, that Clerk by user ID is just this function we already talked about. If there is no user, well, I'm going to insert the user. So this ran for the first time that the user created an account and the Clerk webhook got triggered from the user creation. So we are going to insert a new record inside of our users table. If the user already existed, I'm going to run the patch command, which is an update command in Convex. Now, for these type of functions, if you go back to the documentation under the database, you can see reading data, writing data. This talks about updating data, inserting a new data, and the functions you have available to just run these commands. So that upsert from Clerk is either inserting a new user or updating, patching the current record that we have. Now, the other function that we have is delete from Clerk, which is going to delete a user from Clerk. So again, we're going to get the user by their identity. If they don't if it's not null, so if they do exist, we're going to delete them. Otherwise, we're just going to say this doesn't exist. Okay, so these are the functions that we need working with our users' data or table inside of Convex. So now let's go back. So we have defined the user table schema. We have defined these mutations and upserting and deleting users functions. This is all we just did inside of our users folder. Again, I created this users.ts inside of our Convex. Again, don't put stuff inside of the generated, which I did in the beginning. You have to just put them directly inside of your Convex. Now, this makes me also think that I did not put the auth.config.ts also correctly. So let me just recreate that one again and be back. Okay, so I recreated this auth.config.ts, which was meant to be inside of our Convex folder, but I put it inside of the generated, which is going to get wiped out automatically because this is just generated by Convex server. So I've just included this, which was pointing to our issuer URL in our Clerk. This was to integrate Clerk and Convex together. And we created a JWT template, and we needed to point this to our issuer inside of our Clerk dashboard. I just brought this outside here. Okay, so let's go back now inside of the docs. Okay, here. So we created these mutations and files and functions that works with our user table, again, inside of this user that lives inside of our Convex. Now, the next step is actually to create our webhook endpoint, which is through something called an HTTP endpoint that you can expose using Convex again. Okay, so let me just copy this part of the code. You have access to it inside of the documentation as well. So let's bring this into our Convex folder. So you will create this http.ts file, and this allows you to expose an endpoint in your Convex backend service. So this is not going to expose an endpoint in your NextJS app, but it is going to expose an endpoint inside of your Convex. Now we'd have to install Swix to verify the signature coming from Clerk. We're going to do that in a second, but let's see what we're doing here. So on this HTTP client that I'm creating from Convex, I am creating a route. The route is going to be a post pointing to that same endpoint that we create when creating the Clerk webhook. So if I go back to my Clerk dashboard and to our webhooks, the endpoint we had was pointing to our URL endpoint in Convex, but the path was Clerk users webhook. This is the same path that we are creating inside of our application or inside of our Convex backend. The method is going to be post, and then we expose a handler function from this endpoint. Now this handler is going to validate the request. Just make sure that the request is coming in from Clerk. Now how do we do this? Well, we have an extra function we are running, which is basically reading the payload of the request and getting our webhook secret that we have set inside of our local environment variable, and that's why you needed to run this. And this verifies whether or not this is coming from Clerk. And if it does, it's just going to pass. Otherwise, it is not going to verify. Now, once we verify that this is actually coming in from our Clerk dashboard or Clerk events, we're going to just switch over the type of the events that we have. User.created, .updated, .deleted are the type of events that we are listening to or ask Clerk to send a webhook for us. Now for the created and updated, we're going to run this mutation, which is internal because we exposed an internal mutation, if you remember, on our users table called obsert from Clerk. Do you remember this? This is this obsert from Clerk that was an internal mutation that either inserts or updates a user object. So run that mutation, internal mutation on the users table, and call the obsert from Clerk function, pass the data that it requires. Again, we needed this data inside of our args, this data, and that's what we're passing to it. We're passing event.data. Event.data is coming from Clerk. Now it has that user object inside of it. Now this is an intentional fall through here. So for created and updated, for both of them, we're going to run the same thing. Remember, inside of this function, if the user already existed, it's going to update. If it doesn't, it's going to insert. So it runs the same function for both events. If the event type is deleted, we're going to run the mutation called delete from Clerk, and we're going to delete this specific user by this ID. And finally, we run and return a 200 response, which gives this indication to Clerk that everything is okay on our side, because when you're responding to a webhook, if you return a status of error like 400, Clerk is going to retry sending this webhook. So anytime that you're done, you have to return a status of 200. So that is going to create an endpoint inside of our inside of our Convex backend to respond to this Clerk event. Now let's just quickly install this, which is picked up here as well. So let's go to our local dev server and pm add Swix. Again, this is used to verify the signature to make sure that the webhook is actually coming from Clerk. So let's pm dev again. Now, if I switch back to the terminal that was running Convex functions, now everything is back functional there. So we now have this HTTP action as well. So let's go back inside of our notes for a second. So we created this webhook endpoint, and now everything needs to be synced. So we created this HTTP TS, which is basically the same code that I went over with you. And now everything should be synced up using the current user's document. Again, this is just showing how you can now use the current user inside of any mutation or any query that you run. You now have access to this context object, and you can use the user document from your own database. Okay, so let's go to our application now. And let's refresh the app, making sure that we are running the latest version of our changes. Let me also make this bigger. Now, if I go ahead and sign into our application now, we should be able to sign into our Clerk, but also synchronize everything with our Convex dashboard. So let's just hard reload and empty the cache here. Let's click sign in. Let's continue with Google. I'm going to select my account. This is going to log me in. But if I go back to my dashboard and users, now I have this user now created inside of my Convex database on top of my Clerk. Because in Clerk now, if I go to overview, now I have this new logged in user. Again, you can just depend on Clerk for your data. Anytime that you would need to access users' data beyond the currently logged in user, you need to have the user data inside your own database. But if you don't, if your app doesn't require that specific feature, you can just leave it at Clerk. The other thing that you would want to consider is to have your user data at all times, so you're not locked in to Clerk. You can just change when you have your user data. You can change them to any other platform or authentication provider in future. So that also works well. So we've completed this step where we created our users and we store the users in our Convex database. Now next, let's work with defining a post schema, create a write path to actually mutate and create new blog posts and the rest that comes along there. Okay, so let's do this next. Let me close everything that we have here. Our functions are running, our development server is running. So let me close up the terminal, go inside of our app, and let's create a new path called write. Inside of it, we're going to create a page.tsx. And now inside of this page, we're going to create a form where the user can paste in information, title slug, a new image, and the body of their post, and then publish it. So let's go ahead and create this component, and then I'm going to explain what we're doing here. Now, for most of the part of this coding or the tutorials, I copy paste code, primarily not to take forever to create these components. I'd love to hear your feedback if this is actually the ideal way, because sometimes we are repeating code that has been explained from the past, or you can watch in more details in different videos that I link in the description. But let me know if you actually prefer for me to go in line by line and actually live code everything instead of copy pasting. I assume that this just saves time. I explain from a high level individual steps that we need to take and why we are doing what we're doing, but we're just not typing to save some time. So we have this new post form that we have imported inside of our page here. Let's Command Shift P and reload for this to take effect. Now inside of our new post form, we have to install some dependencies. So let's just go ahead and get that out of the way. I'm going to go inside of our second terminal, pause the dev server. Sorry, I turned my keyboard into Persian. So let's clear this out. Now we need Zod. We are using React Hook Forms and Zod validation. There's a video on the channel where we talk about React Hook Forms integrating with Zod and server actions. In this example, we're not going to use server actions. We're going to use the mutations from Convex, which we're going to see in a second, but the rest is just the same. So let's also add React Hook Form. The other library we need is the resolvers. So let's add hook form /resolvers. We're going to also use Novel, which is a Notion style WYSIWYG editor. Again, there's a video on the channel where I talk about this editor. We implement a blogging experience using Novel, so you can reference that video. We also need some components from ShatCN, so also let's add them here. So npm dlx ShatCN at latest. You can hit the add command and then select the components that you need. We need the input. We need the dialog for this file. So let's go and select the input. And we already passed the dialog, so let's hit enter. Let's clear this out. Now we need a couple of extra files here, like if we have to define a schema for our form, we need to have our editor and our image uploader, which we're going to do in a second. So let's run the dev server again. Let's close the terminal and let me explain from a high level what's happening inside of this new post form. So first thing, let's define this new post schema. Inside of my lib folder, I'm going to create this schemas file. This is not the schema for Convex, it's just a schema for our Zod. So this is to verify the form when it gets submitted on the client side, but also on the server side to make sure that it has the required fields here. So we have the title, which is a string, minimum, it's required, slug is required, excerpt is required, cover image is optional, and then the content, which is a JSON content format from Novo, is the actual body of our post. So let's go back. We now have this schema. So let's open up this form from a high level. Let me just scroll down to our form. We are rendering a form with some information about our post. So from a high level again, we have the cover image, which is going to get the ID back once we upload this image into our file storage from Convex, which I'm going to show you how we're going to do it. If you remember, we click a button that basically opens up a modal, which is this dialog component from ShatCN. So a selected file as a trigger, it opens up a modal, and inside of that modal, we are rendering this image uploader component, which we're going to build and implement together. So that's for our cover image. We're going to dive into this component in a second. So let me just move over to the other ones, and then we're going to come back to this. We have the title and the slug. So the first input uses the register function from React Hook Forms. Again, if you're not comfortable with React Hook Forms, there's a video on the channel where I explain this in details. So use form from React Hook Forms gives you back this register function that you can call and spread over your fields. That gives you all the state setters and event listeners necessary to read and update this value from this input. Underneath each one of these fields, we have this errors object coming back from our form state from Zod that gives us access to any errors that happens that are mapped to the specific name of the fields that we have, in this case title. We also have the slug. The slug is automatically generated from the input. So what I'm doing here, instead of having the user to type this in, I am watching the title, and then every time the title changes, I'm calling this create slug from name and pass title to it. Now let's create that function together for a second. So I'm going to go to lib and utils. Let me replace this here. So this cn function is what comes out of ShatCN. Create name from slug gets the name and just basically replaces the characters that are not safe for the URL, and then replaces them with an empty string and returns that back in. We have some utility functions or helpers here that we're going to use when they come in handy. Let's go back to our form. Anytime our title changes, we're going to create a slug out of it. And then we're going to call this set value, which is coming again from the React hook form or the use form, to set the slug, and we validate that field. So that was the title and slug. For the excerpt, it's just a regular text input. We have registered the excerpt and show the errors. For the content, we are actually rendering a component called editor, which is from Novel. So let me just copy this editor component. So we have this folder called editor. This is all the necessary components that you would need to work with Novel. There is a video on the channel where I just specifically talk about the Novel package. If we build a Next.js app and incorporate this editor into that app, I'm not going to repeat it here. You can just reference that video, link in the description. But basically, this array of components exposes an editor for us that's just going to be the WYSIWYG or Notion style editor with all the data or the options that we pass to it. Now we need to have some components here. So separator from ShatCN, let me just install them here. So pm DLX ShatCN add latest add separator. Now up here we also need a post type, which is coming from our schema that we are going to define in a second for our convex. So we're going to create this shortly. So we have this here. There's some other packages that we need to install. So let's go to the editor and actually check to see if we have everything we need. So we need the popover. Okay, so let's install popover from ShatCN. Let's reload to see if this is something we need to install here. So the popover from ShatCN actually uses Radix UI under the hood, so that's why I refreshed to make sure that this is actually needed here, which isn't. So let's go to math selector. See if there's anything else we need to. Okay, lowlight is for syntax highlighting, so let's pm add lowlight as well. You can paste in code snippets inside of your the body of your content, and that would use this lowlight package to syntax highlight. And I think we are done here with the packages that we need. So let's close this up and that utility. Let's run the server here, pm dev. Okay, so that's our editor. We're going to use the editor to edit the content, but we're also going to use the editor to show the edited content or show the content on the client side. Hence why I'm passing this editable prop to this and a set content. So if I open up the editor again, you can see down here when we are initializing this component, this editor content, it is going to give us some props. So I'm listening for different props like on update and on create. Now, when I'm creating an instance of this editor, if you have passed in for this component not to be editable, I will set the editable to false, which is going to just be a read-only editor. The reason why I'm doing this is that it makes it easy to give this experience to the user to create the content when they are creating a blog post, but also when we are fetching this blog post to show them to other users, instead of having to go through this content JSON and then render them in a similar fashion with the similar styling. Not to duplicate the styling, I'm just using the same editor instance. I'm just setting it to not be editable, and then it just shows the content of the editor with the same styling that we have already passed. Now, what I'm also doing on update is I am calling that set content function that we passed into this component. We are getting the instance of the editor inside of this on update event handler, and then calling the get JSON on it. It's going to return a JSON version of the content inside of our editor, which I am setting in my React hook form. This is actually calling this set content. This set content is going to call the set value from the React hook form and set the content field to the content that was passed in. So I'm holding the state up inside of my React hook form, or this form, and then passing this state setter function down to the editor to call this function and update the content anytime there is a change on the editor. That's from a high level how it works. Again, you can watch the video to dive deeper into the editor itself if any part of this is confusing. Now, for the editor styling to work correctly, we need to copy a prose mirror into the app. So let me just go back and close this up. This prose mirror is some CSS that just works with your editor, and it just makes it, for styling purposes, it makes it looks nicer and works well with the different extensions that you have inside of your Notion style editor. So that's one thing we need to do. We also need to copy some styling for our syntax highlighting. So let me just also copy that. So lowlight is going to expose or set some CSS classes for us that we need to now style. So I'm going to just paste in this CSS styles. It just again is coming from lowlight. It targets the pre-tag, which is how the code is going to be rendered inside of our code snippets in our editor. Okay, so with this out of the way, we have the styling, we have the syntax highlighting. We are passing the state setter function to our editor, and this should be good. And lastly, we have this button that just goes ahead and submits this form, shows different versions depending on whether or not we're submitting it's disabled or says different stuff. Okay, so let me go back actually up and see what else we have here. I'm going to go to the cover image because we skipped over that one. That's actually an important part, talking to the file storage in Convex. But before we go to that implementation, let's just look what happens when we hit the submit button to submit this form. Now, this onSubmit handler is going to call the handle submit from use form. This makes sure that our fields pass the validation that we specified using auth schemas. And if they do pass, it calls this process form function that we defined up top here. So this receives the verified data. I'm getting the content out of it. Now I couldn't enforce any content verification because we are using a custom field with the JSON type. If I go back to my schema, you can see this is a custom version. You can define custom validations here. I didn't, so therefore inside of my process form, I'm checking to see if they've actually passed in any content. So I'm getting the content JSON from the data, moving inside of that object or JSON to see if there is any section with any length. So if they have actually created any content. And if they haven't, I'm going to return early and say, show them a toast notification to say, hey, please add some content to the post, because you can't publish a post if it doesn't have any content. And if they have already, I'm going to go ahead and call create post, which is a function or a mutation we're going to create together using Convex. But for now, let's just leave this and we're going to come back to this create post. This is similar to your server actions, but it's not a server action. It is actually running a server defined mutation that we have defined inside of our Convex. And the way that I have gotten a handle of this is through this use mutation hook. So similar to the way that we have defined queries and use them using the use query hook, we can create mutations and access them through this use mutation. We have to generate that specific API. We get the create post function, and this is going to allow us to submit a mutation to our database, which is what we're going to do from this point when they actually submit the form. So we pass in the data, we pass in the cover image ID. I'm just changing the data type here so Convex doesn't scream at us, because the image ID is actually referencing the ID of the file inside of our storage. It's a string, but this is a more specific type. So I'm passing this in to make sure that this is also reading or it's the similar type as what Convex expects. And the content, I'm going to stringify this JSON context to save it as a string inside of my database. If there is no post slug, I'm going to throw an error, which is going to show a toast notification. But if it is successful, I'm going to redirect the user to that specific post slug that is returned from our mutation function and show a post successful toast notification that the post was created. So a couple of things we need to address here. One is this mutation, and the next or before that is actually uploading an image. So let's start with uploading an image. So inside of this cover image, we showed a trigger that opens up a dialog. The dialog was opening up this image uploader. So let's create this image uploader component and then see how we would go about uploading an image to Convex. So let's go inside of our component. This is the image uploader. I'm going to also copy our custom spinner to the UI folder. Okay, so I have just copied this. A spinner is not from ShatCN, but I have created it using the same concepts. So using the CVA to create different variants for a spinner, and a component that is just an SVG, but having an animation of spin. But it also allows you to pass in a size variant for different sizes. So that's what we're using inside of this image uploader. So what are we doing here? From a high level, again, the image uploader is going to be let me close this off. It's going to be a form, and this form is the form that I opened up in the beginning of the app, if you remember. So if I go to the Medium clone, so if you go to the right and hit this trigger, the modal opens up, and this form is what we're talking about right now inside of our application. It has an input hooked up to a div that's basically listening to some drag and drop functionality. Now you can use drag and drop packages and libraries. We have had instances of them on our channel too. So there is a drag and drop type of file upload video on the channel as well. We can reference that. Or use any drag and drop component you want here. I'm basically using inspirations from one of the Vercel's templates from uploading images to just create this functionality manually instead of using a package, which is basically listening to different events and creating that drag and drop functionality, allowing us to select a file, show a preview of the file, and then once all of that is done, to submit this form using this button. Okay. Now let's see what's happening inside of this handle submit when we actually submit this form. So we're going to prevent the default, stop the propagation. There are some saving states here. Now to upload an image to your Convex backend, there's two steps. The first step is to generate an upload URL. So if you reference the documentation again for this, you can go under storage and upload. This is going to teach you how to generate an upload URL and then use that URL to upload your file, which is basically exactly what we are doing here. So we are generating a URL. We're going to dive into this function in a second, but this just gives us a post URL, a URL endpoint that we can just send a post request to with our file. This is a short-lived URL, so you need to use it right when you create it. I think it's valid for an hour or less than that. You can reference the docs, but basically it gives you the URL that you can use to post your file. Once you do this, it's going to give you back a storage ID, so the ID of the file that you just uploaded. And then we're calling the set image ID, which is what we have passed into this component. So set image ID is a function that I'm passing in that basically uses the set value from use hook form to set the cover image ID field to the URL, or basically to the ID that it's passed in here. It's not the URL, it's the ID. And then it closes the file picker or the dialog that we opened up to actually select this file. Now, this is a similar pattern of what we have used inside of our editor, where we're holding this state up in the React hook form and then passing this state setter functions to the editor, or in this case, to our image uploader. Okay, so we set that ID, we close that dialog down, show its success, and if anything goes wrong, we show a toast notification. And finally, after everything is done, we're going to set the saving state back to false. Okay. And up here, you can see we have some local states. We're going to define this use mutation, which is going to generate the upload URL in a second. We have the data, we have the file selected, we have drag, and the saving state, and an on change picture. So when they select a different file, this is how we're reading the content of the file, generating a preview to set it to our data so we can show a preview of that file. So pretty typical stuff when you are working with files. This type of stuff is usually exposed to you if you're using a drag and drop component. But if you were to just implement this manually, this is how you would do it. Okay, so that's that. Now, while we're here, let's actually talk about this use mutation hook and generating this upload URL. So let me go back to our Convex folder. Inside of our schemas, when we started defining our user schema, we actually defined the post schema as well. So let's talk about that too. So we defined a table inside of our Convex database, and we set the shape of our documents. There's this. They have a title, they have a slug, they have an excerpt, they have a content, They have a cover image ID, which is referencing and a storage ID. So it's referencing a file inside of our Convex storage. It's optional because they can choose not to have a cover image for the blog post. We have an author ID. This is the user ID. So this comes from the user table inside of our Convex database. And this V is what we get out of Convex values. That basically defines the shape of the type of our fields. And like switch is a number, we also created an index for our posts table by slug. So anytime we are searching our blog posts by slug, it will be a faster query. Now, this is how you would define tables and schemas. So basically, you're just defining TypeScript shapes and schemas instead of having to use a third-party ORM like Prisma or Drizzle. You're just using Convex for defining schemas to talk to the database and to basically define the shape of your data and get the type end-to-end type safety. Okay, so we have our posts schema. Now, similar to the users, I'm going to create another module inside of my Convex for posts. These are going to be all the functions that I need to work with the posts table. I'm going to explain one by one, but let's start from this generate upload URL. So I'm getting the mutation from the generated server, passing in a callback to this that receives the context, and I'm calling the context storage and generate upload URL on it and returning this. This is what I'm calling inside of this image uploader. Use mutation, access the API posts table, generate upload URL. This is what I named this function, which is basically calling that function from Convex to generate that short-lived post endpoint. Now, this is again straight from the documentation. So you can see here using mutation, generate upload URL. When you scroll down here, you can see how you're actually creating this mutation or function inside of your messages. In this instance, it's inside of our posts table, which is basically calling this function on our storage object. So as simple as that, we generate the URL, pass it back down here. So now when this function is called inside of our handle submit, we're going to get a URL back, and the rest we've already explained. We send a post request to that endpoint and upload our file and get a storage ID back. Okay. Now let's also explain the other files that we have here. Again, similar to the users table, we have get posts, which is a query function. The handler is what actually fetches our posts. It is querying our posts table, ordering them in an ascending order, collecting all the data there. Now, for our posts, we need to map over each post and actually fetch the author as well as the cover image. Let's just start with the author. Now, inside of our schema, if you remember, we only had the author ID. So inside the schema, for our posts, we only have the author ID, which is the ID of a user inside of our users table. So when we're mapping over every post here, we're going to get that specific post author ID and fetch our database to get that ID. Now, this query might seem different from the query that I'm running above, in that here I'm specifying the name of the table, but down here I am not. This is because the IDs generated across all of your tables in Convex are unique. So when you're fetching a specific ID, it just works without even defining the table. You can also run this same way that we did up there. It's just a different way here. So I have the author object. I'm going to include that author object inside of my post as well, because when I want to get all of the posts to, let's say, show them inside of our homepage. So if we go back to our homepage You see we have the author information. We also need the cover image. So going back to our implementation here, we fetch the author object from the users table. And we have to do the same thing for our cover image, because cover image, at this point, we only have the ID, the storage ID. Now we need to fetch the URL that actually that image can be hosted or can be shown. So down here, I'm saying if the cover image ID exists, set another field on our document that we're returning from get posts that sets the cover image URL to the result of this function. Now, this is how you would get a URL that is the live hosted version or URL for that specific image. So on the storage, there is a function called getURL, and you just need to pass it the storage ID of the file you are referring to. So post.cover image is going to give me back a URL this time. So on my post document, I'm going to have the author ID, but also the author object. I'm going to have the cover image ID, but also the cover image URL that I can show and that I can use in my application to show the post image. Now, similar to this, get recent posts does something very similar in that it is just taking, I may not have updated this here, but the get recent posts is going to just render them in a descending order. So the newest first, and then it is going to take 5, let's say. We don't need to call collect on it, just similar to what we had on the users, to only get the 5 most recent posts. Okay. Now, get post by slug is another query that I'm exposing. This time I need a slug to be passed in as the args to my function. And inside of my handler, again, I have access to the arguments passed to this function. And this time I'm just fetching or finding a post with that specific slug. And this is how you would run it. Remember, we have set a slug index to make this query faster. So I'm going to access the posts table, run a query with index by slug, and I can pass in a filter function here to say, give me the records that their slug field equals to this slug. If there's no post, you can throw an error, handle it where you're calling this function. I'm in this case returning null. And similar to what we did up, I'm also fetching the author and the cover image URL. So far we have had queries. Now let's look at mutations. So the first mutation is to actually create a post. This is what we're calling from our form. It requires a couple of fields or data or arguments to be passed to this: title, slug, excerpt, content, and cover image ID when we are creating a post. And again, I'm referencing the cover image type as an ID from our storage. Inside of our handler, we make sure to get the current user because we only want to allow authenticated users to be able to create posts. And this function, create user or throw, it's a function that we defined inside of our users objects. It fetches the currently logged in user, and if there is no user, it's going to throw an error. So that's why it is called get current user or throw. So this throws an error if you're not logged in. If you're here, it means you were logged in. So the data that we have passed to this handler function, that's inside the args. The author ID is going to be the user underscore ID. This didn't come in from our data. We need to pass it in here because our post needs to have an author ID. And we're going to initialize likes to 0. Then we're going to use the insert function on the posts table and post a new record. But from this function, I'm returning this slug. Now remember when we were calling this new post form function. So up here inside the process form, once we have all the data that we need, we were calling this create post function, which came out of this use mutation hook. API posts, create post, right? I'm passing in the data, cover image ID, and content. And this returns the post slug because this is what I'm returning from here. Data.post slug. So I'm saying once you created this post, give me the slug back. Now I've passed in this slug here anyways, but I'm getting it from the data. So this is coming in from the record that I have inside of my own database. The reason why I'm getting the slug is that I want to just redirect the user back to that slug page. Okay. So that was our new post form and also the image uploader using 2 mutations. Now, the last mutation that we have inside of our posts is like a post. So we want to enable users to like a post. So we need a slug. So that's passed into our function, handler function. We're going to find that post from that slug the same way we just did upstairs. If there is no post, I'm returning null. You can also enable this so a user cannot like their own post. So I'm also getting the current logged in user with the same function that we did upstairs. So if you're not logged in, you cannot like a post. We can also throw an error here and handle it on the client side to show a post notification. I'm not doing that here, but you can basically return anything from here and read it from where you're calling this function to then show the corresponding error notifications. Now, we haven't worked on the page where we're actually calling this like post. Since we're here, I'm explaining it, but we're going to have a dynamic slug page for our posts where we can actually show the posts, and then we're going to implement that together as well. So you can just have that if the post.author ID is similar to the user ID or the currently logged in user, we want to return null, meaning that they cannot like their own post. You can add that if you want. For testing purposes, I'm going to comment this out so I can just like my own posts. Then you have the patch function to actually update this post with this ID and increment the like by 1. So this is our like post mutation that requires a slug and just increments the like for that specific post. We're going to come back to this function a little later when we are creating our dynamic slug page. Okay, so let's close this off. Now we have everything we needed inside of our image uploader and our new post form. The only thing remaining is that inside of our editor, we were actually accessing the post. If you remember here, for what we are passing in to this editor, we are also passing in the post, because again, on the dynamic slug page, we are using the read-only version of this editor. If we want to pass in the post to be able to show the content, we're going to see this on the other end, but we need this type, which is coming from lib types. So let me just create this where I have created a little type for how our post's shape is. So this type is just showing an individual post where we're actually fetching the author and the cover image URL. So it has an ID creation time. These are system fields that are going to be passed in automatically by Convex. Image ID, image URL, title, slug, and the good stuff there, and also the author object, which is when we're actually fetching the author and passing it to this post object as well. So with this out of the way, now I have also this file here. So let me just Command Shift Prompt, reload the window. You can also just reload the TS server, and that should also do the job. So now we are done. I think we have covered everything in the new post form to be able to create a new post. Okay. Now, when we create a new post, if you remember, we're going to redirect the users back to that dynamic slug page. So why don't we create that dynamic slug page next, so we can go through a creation of a post end to end, and then we're going to work on our homepage experience. So inside of here, I'm going to create a folder called posts. Inside of it, there's going to be another dynamic folder called slug. And inside of it, I'm going to create a page.tsx. Okay. Now, let's see what we're doing here. So a post page, a dynamic post page, is going to receive the params object from Next.js. There's going to be a slug on it because we call this dynamic page slug. And we're passing this slug to a custom post component. So let's create this custom post component inside of our component. So let's create this post component. And let's see what are we doing here. Now we need to get the avatar from chat.cn, but this is our post component. It receives a slug and it uses use query hook from Convex. It accesses our own tailored API or client on the posts file or table and get post by slug. These are the functions we just created together. So inside of our posts, we had this get post by slug. It's just basically referencing that function. And it requires you to pass in the slug. So that's how you can pass the second or the arguments to this function right inside of this use query hook. So I get the post back. I'm also getting a hang of the like post mutation function by calling use mutation, accessing the API client, posts and like posts. This is again this last function we talked about. This is going to enable the user to like a post. So I have my query function and mutation. If we don't have any posts, I'm going to call the not found function, which is going to render a 404 page. For this, we need to create a not found file inside of our app. It can be in the global scope, so it covers everything. So if no path matches, Next.js is going to render this not found page, which is just basically a section saying a custom 404 message and a link to go back home. So this not found function, you don't need to return this function. It just basically renders the not found. It throws an error, so therefore it renders the not found page. Now, if I don't have a post here, this is different than it being null. This is if this query ran, if this fetch ran and I could not find the slug you're looking for. But when I don't have a post or when it's undefined, it may be because this query is running. So that's why I'm showing a spinner here until this is actually running, because this is on the client side fetching our data from a server function we defined using Convex functions on the backend. Now, you might think this is a dynamic slug page and we are rendering it using a client component. What if we wanted to render a server component here? So let's go back inside of our documentation, and there is a way for rendering server-side components here. Just try and see if I can find it here. Let's go to quick starts and Next.js. Right up top on the quick start, there's this server rendering section, which basically tells you how to use Convex in your server components. Basically, instead of calling the use query, you can use fetch query, pass in the same function, and get your tasks back. In this case, it's fetching the tasks. You're fetching a specific post. So you can do that as well. The reason why I'm using a client component is that you're going to see in a second on the page, because on the client side, Convex actually establishes a WebSocket connection to your database. you would see real-time updates in your data. So if I hit the like button on a blog post, because it's a real-time database, without any refreshing of the page, I'm going to be able to see that update. Whereas if you use the server component, you could still revalidate after you've done the mutation, but you have to remember to take that extra step of revalidating the cache, because in terms of the server component, they're cached from Next.js perspective. So anytime you run the mutation, you have to revalidate that point, that endpoint or that path. So therefore you see the fresh data. So just to see the real-time functionality of Convex, I'm still staying as a client component. And once we have our post back, this is just a matter of showing the details of the post, the author data, the metadata, the cover image, if there is any, and then the content. Now, this is where I'm using that editor again. This time I'm passing in a post and I'm setting the editable to false. So this just renders the same instance of the editor, gets the post, which is then going to set the initial content to post.content. So it already comes with content, and we have set it to be not editable. So it just shows as a read-only instance of our editor with the same styling. Okay, so that's our dynamic slug page. Now I need to install the avatar. So let me just open up the dev server here. pm add or dlx shatcn at latest add avatar. Okay, so let's rerun the server. Let's also make sure everything is okay with our Convex functions. Now, it seems like we have everything we need to create a blog post from here. So let's go back to our application, to the local version. Let's just refresh the cache and reload the server here. Okay. Now I need to go to the right page. I don't have a link here up top in the header, but I manually go to my /right page. This is the page we created. We put in the new post form, which is going to collect the necessary information from us and create a post. So let's start by selecting a file, each image that we have. So this is uploaded successfully, and we have the image ID set automatically. So test, let's say test from local dev. This is an excerpt. And here I don't see the correct styling. And the reason why for this is that we've included, if you remember, this prose mirror CSS, but we actually never used it. So we have to go back inside of our layout and actually import this right where we are importing our global CSS. So let's go up. We're bringing our global CSS, but we also need to import our prose mirror. Now, if I go back to the app, yes, we now see the / command. So this is a test from local dev. So I have the image, the title, slug, and excerpt. So let's create the post. Post is created. It redirects us back to the dynamic slug page with the slug. And now we see our post. Well, we obviously didn't have much inside the editor, but this is the editor in a read-only version. You can see I can't do anything with it. It's just a read-only version of our editor. Now back inside the homepage, we still need to fetch some data and show the sections that we have on the right-hand side. And let's do that part next. So let's close out of this. Let's go back inside of our homepage. and I'm going to replace the content of our home page and then explain what we are going to do here. So we're going to have a couple of components, a component that shows our posts on the left-hand side. Again, for the final version, we have this section where it renders our posts here. And we have this sections where we have our 3 different card components showing recent posts, recommended topics, and who to follow. Now, for now, these components, other than the first one, which just renders our posts and a link to actually go to those posts, the other components don't do anything, so you can't really follow anyone. I will leave that to you if you want to extend the application. At the end, when we are recapping the application, I'm going to tell you future steps that you can take in to extend the application. But nevertheless, we're going to implement these 3 sections using these components here. So we have one, the posts, we have the recent posts, recommendations, and who to follow card components on the right-hand side. So let me just copy these components, and then we're going to dive into the individual ones to make sure that we understand. So recommended topics, let's just bring in this guy. Let's bring in who to follow. Let's bring in posts. Let's bring in post item. And let's bring in also recent posts. Okay, I think we have what we need. Let's close this off. Go inside of our app and page. Let's refresh, Control-Shift-P. Okay, so let's start from the first component, which is our posts component. Here, we're using use query hook, again, inside of a client component. A similar fashion, you can use the server side or the fetch query function to use Convex inside of server components. I still stick with the client components. There's nothing wrong with using client components, but you now know that you have 2 options. Maybe for this one, we could have used the server components because we don't have that real-time functionality that we need for liking blog posts. So we can render this on the server side using the fetch query. And then once the folks are on that individual blog post, we can use a client component there to establish that WebSocket connection so we get the real-time database changes. But the good thing about this is also, if now somebody creates a new post, this, because it is using a client component to render this post component, it is going to be updated with a newly created post. So usually or typically inside of a server, inside of a NextJS app where you're using server components, if you are pushing data to your database from outside of your NextJS app, let's say you're using a CMS to create a blog post. Now you need to trigger a webhook to revalidate the cache and rebuild to reflect those changes here. Now, if you want to bypass that idea, and that's why we're using this use client here also in the posts component, is at any time now a new post is created from any of our users, as long as it is pushed to our Convex database, because all of our applications or instances are connected through WebSocket with our main real-time database, they all are going to get the new post without us having to revalidate any cache or deal with the NextJS cache, which is the great thing that you get out of using the use client in this instance. So again, I'm calling this get post function. We've defined this inside of our posts before. This just calls a handler, fetches all of our posts, shows them here. If I don't have any posts, I'm showing a spinner. Otherwise, I'm mapping over my posts, and for each one, I'm rendering a post item. Now, for each post item, I have a link or list element, a link that goes to that individual post, the information about the author, the post details, the cover image, if there is any, to just show a nice little list item of all of my posts. So that's the first component. The second one is recent posts. Similarly, it is going to use the use query, but instead of getting the post, it gets the get recent posts function from our Convex backend and just shows a card component, and it's just mapping over every post inside of this UI. For each one, it's just rendering a list element and a link to just go to that post. Again, this is talking about this component up top, where we have different blog posts and a link to go to that specific blog post. This is the one that we just created as a test in the beginning. Okay, so let's go back. We need the card component here, so let's just install this. Let's go to pm dlx shad cn add latest add card. Let's actually see if there is anything else we need, and then we're going to come back to running our dev server. So next one is recommended topics. This is just a static component. It's not fetching anything. You can add functionality to it if you want. And I need to install the badge. So let's add the badge. This is again another UI component from ShadCN, so you can just add it there. Let's close this off. Last one is who to follow. This seems to have everything that we need. We're using a query again from our Convex backend, get recent users. And here I'm just showing different users and a follow button. Again, this is not doing anything, but if you want to implement this feature where you would enable users to follow other people, get notifications if they publish a new post, you're going to expand it however you want. In this tutorial, our main focus is to introduce Convex as the backend, the file storage, and the real-time database, and how you would go about defining tables and authentication using Clerk. But you can definitely expand beyond what we have here. Okay, so with this out of the way, I think we can run the dev server. Close the terminal. Let's go back to our application. And if I go back to my local host, hopefully we should have the deployed version here. Here we go. Okay, so we are hosting our images on Convex on this endpoint. So we have to set this as a safe domain inside of our next config for our next images to render properly. So let's come here inside of our next config. We can add an images. Here we can have domains, and let's just replace this domain with our Convex domain. This is where our images are going to be served from. Usually you don't need to restart the dev server anymore. This should work. So let's refresh for the new changes to take effect. Sometimes you need to restart your dev server for the next config to take effect, but I think we have it now. Let's just refresh the page one more time here. Okay. So it seems like everything is working. We have the header component up top, our posts, we have the recent posts here, the recommended topics, and who to follow sections over here. You can obviously go to your header component and actually comment out these links that we no longer need. Maybe we can create a button here from, let's just go button from our UI components. Let's go to a link, not to new posts, but we want to go to the right page. So we're going to say, right, this needs to be lowercase. Let's mark this as child, so it's not going to render a button. Instead, it's going to render the link we've passed as a child. Let's set the size up to a small. And now if I go back to my page, we can pass in a variant of secondary. And now I have that right page, which is going to take me to the right path, which is going to allow me to create a new post. Let's just see this in action. Yep, there we go. So we have the new post form, which we've already tested, and it works properly. So we finished our application and added the necessary paths and functions as we required. Now, obviously, you can take this further in the application that we have, or in the example we built together. One thing that I haven't shown, which we can see here, is to actually go on an individual post and actually like this post. Now, this is going to call the like post mutation function we created, which is just going to basically update this post with the newly updated likes. And this is going to update this page right inside of this page to reflect these changes. And that's one of the benefits of using the use client or client component when talking to Convex. Again, Convex creates a WebSocket connection between your application and Convex database. That's the real-time database feature that you get out of Convex. Obviously, you can also have server components, but you have to revalidate the data and deal with NextJS cache, which sometimes gets in the way of actually having real-time data. So depending on your use case, you can decide whether or not to use the fetch query and use server components or use client components like this. Obviously, another benefit for using client components here is that anytime any user now publishes a new post, I immediately would see it here inside of my application without having to bust NextJS cache or revalidate any cache or rebuild my application. Now, another thing that you can build on top of this for individual blog posts is this comment feature. Right now, we don't have any comment feature. If you've been to Medium website, they have a comment feature where you can users can comment on a specific post. It's easy. You can create a comments table. You can create a necessary relationship between the user and which post they belong to. Every post can have an array of comments. Every comment belongs to a post. Every user can have multiple comments. You get the idea. It's basically the same thing as you would do with any other database. In this case, you're using Convex as a database, but you get end-to-end type safety from the server functions and mutations you created all the way to the client side where you're actually using those mutations. And we've seen this in action throughout our application here. Another feature that you can extend on this is to create these follow functions where you can follow an individual contributor to be notified maybe anytime that they have a new blog post. You can add tags or categories to your blog posts. So for recommended topics right now, our posts don't have any tags or categories. You can add that field when you're creating a new post to say what is the categories or tags that this post belongs to. Then you can narrow down a search based on a specific category or a specific task. So I hope this was useful in understanding an end-to-end application that works with Next.js, Convex as a backend, and Clerk as the authentication. We integrated authentication to Convex, so we read the auth session or context inside of our Convex functions, and we also synced our users' data to our Convex database. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up down in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.